Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today we're going to be looking at an interesting trend in IT operations, FinOps, financial operations, sort of riffing off the idea of DevOps back in the day, and all the implications and some of the speed with which it's actually hitting the market. And with me to discuss this are two of the analyst team, Gina Atelsek and Melanie Posey. Welcome back to the podcast to you both.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Always good to be here.
And it's great to have you both on. You're actually just back from the FinOps X conference. But before we dig into what you saw and some of the recent research that we've had out here, I wanted to first do a little background on what is FinOps and why has it cropped up now? Why is it suddenly having its moment in the sun? And what's happened to really shift this focus onto the financial side of IT, I guess maybe more than what we've done historically?
Well, I think the first thing to get on the table is FinOps is all about cost management and some of the angst that organizations have been having about their cloud costs, their AWS bills, their Azure bills. That's been with us for quite a long time. And wrestling that spend to the ground is something that the FinOps Foundation was set up to establish, taking some of the concepts from earlier forms of IT cost management, like IT asset management, for instance, which we're all familiar with. And the thing that's really set it into high gear now is AI, because a lot of AI happens on cloud infrastructure, whether it's training or fine-tuning or inferencing. Cloud infrastructure plays a big role as the foundational element of all of that. And we're at a point now where folks have kicked the tires on generative AI quite a lot, and now they're ready to get down to brass tacks and start implementing it in their organizations. And it's at this point where the C-suite and board of directors potentially will start wanting to see a return on the investment. So in a way, AI is a continuation of the cost angst that came around with cloud, but AI is going to make cloud cost angst look like a garden party.
But this was some of the concerns about cloud cost angst, had been going on for a while, right?
Right. And I think essentially the cause of that is because so much IT has moved to OpEx-based pricing, pay-as-you-go pricing, which is inherently less predictable than putting, a storage array in a data center or a bunch of servers in a data center. And so it's accounting for the variable costs that the whole FinOps framework was set up to address. Now, at last year's FinOps X conference, the biggest ask among the practitioners, and this is primarily a practitioner conference, so it's people coming together to, exchange ideas and to meet, obviously, with, their providers and so on. But the biggest ask was to be able to account for SaaS costs. So software service costs, and in particular, Snowflake and Databricks, which are basically data clouds, right? But the way that they charge it was kind of inscrutable. And so one of the priorities of the FinOps Foundation this past year has been recruiting SaaS vendors, and it will be a priority in the coming year too, to make their cost metrics more understandable using the focus specification that the FinOps Foundation has set up to sort of even the playing field in terms of collecting costs from a bunch of different providers to look at your total cloud spending.
So this is really something that has been this accumulation of cost management pain.
Hmm.
We saw it with the move to cloud. I mean, it sounds like, and maybe there's now enough cloud utilization. Of course, it's something, Melanie, that we've seen in the voice of the enterprise data around cloud. We're now getting to a point of maturity and where there's a lot of leverage of cloud that's out there, and maybe this combination of not only having to get one's financial arms around what we're spending, we've now also got these new models of data capabilities in cloud with the Databricks and Snowflakes of the world that are now starting to really exacerbate this. This is just now this has now reached a level where we've got to do something about it because costs are escalating rapidly. It seems like we're probably not at a point at which we've seen AI costs start to really shoot up, at least in the extent that they probably will, in the course of the next year or so. But it seems like everybody has got that sort of deer in the headlights moment of they can see this coming. We've seen this story before with the cloud shift, and now there's all that much more motivation to get your arms around it.
Yeah, and it's you're spot on there, Eric. And it's, as Gene was saying, is that as AI starts to hit, then the implications for cloud costs become a lot more apparent. Because when you think about AI, we tend to focus on the GPUs. There's a lot of talk about NVIDIA and, all of the neo cloud players like CoreWeave that are out there in the market, but that's just one piece of it. So when you look at AI FinOps, you can manage your GPUs in a similar way that you manage your CPUs and your other instances that you have with the cloud providers. But then when you get up into that software layer and you think about all of the data that's going to be flying around in the ether with AI, just thinking about AI agents for a second who tend to draw data from a lot of different places to deliver you your answer or your fix on your desktop. And you start to see that there are a lot of different components of costs. It's not just the infrastructure, it's not just the data platform, it's the models too. And there's a completely different way of measuring and accounting for costs. Once you get up into that model layer, you're talking about tokens in the case of AI, or you're talking about credits or units or some other measure that is not dollars per instance or hours used, which we've been familiar with in the infrastructure as a service world. So what we saw at FinOps this year was that folks are getting ready for that. And in some of our voice of the enterprise data, we've seen a pretty substantial jump in FinOps adoption among folks who are using cloud right now, going from around 50% last year to a bit over 60% this year. So maybe folks are kind of using past experience to get a little bit ahead of the costs that they're going to be facing coming down the pike. And, I guess one of the other issues here is, in addition to bringing SaaS costs into the FinOps framework, there's the broader issue of how do we look at our IT costs across the board in a holistic fashion. So nobody just has infrastructure as a service and everything in the cloud. Folks have infrastructure, and in the AI situation, especially data that's sitting in some kind of private on-premises environment. It might be a private cloud in an enterprise data center. It might be private cloud in a co-location facility. But how do you account for costs in a cloudy-like fashion when you're looking at things that are cloud, things that aren't cloud, things that are data, things that are software? And what the FinOps Foundation is doing is expanding its remit to kind of beat everything down into a lowest common denominator where you can have conversion equations or conventions, if you will, to get everything down to dollars. You measure it in terms of how it's consumed, but at the end of the day, the nirvana of all of this is to be able to see the entirety of your cloud costs, your infrastructure costs, your software costs, and then be able to allocate that to specific business processes or business metrics like customer satisfaction or total sales or number of tickets closed. So it's really becoming a bigger discipline, and kind of the dream that analysts like us who've been in this space for a long time have been hearing about for a while is that, if IT actually is a driver of business value, let's prove it. Show us the numbers.
Well, you raise what is a really important point, which is that aspect of, we've been through various generations of trying to figure out what are IT costs, and they got rolled into overhead, and it was just the stuff that got paid for because it was simply too hard to figure out how you allocated cost. But there were initiatives like chargeback and showback in which, you'd charge a department for whatever they were doing, or at least hopefully show them and in some way help inform what they were doing with all this stuff. But it was really hard to actually allocate all this stuff in a way in which you could credibly start to look at really bounding costs. But it seems like we're now to a point at which we've maybe got enough data to start looking at this. And, because one of the great things about cloud, we kind of saw it in the transition to virtualization, is that we were able to get a lot more data out of a virtualized infrastructure to show how well it was operating, how efficiently it was operating. We could start to share workloads across various physical systems. In cloud, we've now got systems that are throwing off a ton of data. We've got telemetry on all sorts of things, how well it's operating, all the rest of it. We were still doing a pretty bad job, but if you think about what was the biggest issue with cloud, is that it was, how do you figure out how big an instance in the cloud do you need? Do you need a large one, a medium, a small one? And of course, if you ask the development team, they're always going to say, well, we need a big one because we need to ensure that there's sufficient performance. And then you run it and people realize, well, maybe we didn't need it quite that large, but yet you're still paying for the large. So there was sort of that thing hovering in the background. But finally, we're to an environment where we've started to get to a point at which we actually are doing something with a lot of the data that all these environments throw off. And maybe that's a point at which we can start to think a little differently, or I don't know, we headed in that way? Do we have enough data? What do we do with that?
Well, I'll say that what you're describing, like right-sizing instances, is something that these FinOps companies have been doing, monitoring and measuring algorithmically, and not in many cases, but they might have, one-click remediation or something. So not autonomous. Enterprises are not ready to have software tinker with their instance sizes without having human approval generally. But one thing, they have been collecting a lot of data. Each FinOps company has its own metrics and algorithms that it uses to optimize costs using whatever software or platform they expose to their customers. But they're also collecting data on the back end for and not in a nefarious way. Most of them work within cloud provider accounts so that they are getting actual costs with discounts built in. So any enterprise agreements are accounted for. And a lot of these products, their goal is to maximize the coverage of the commitment discounts of the, compute reservations that they've made, or database
So you
reservations.
you've already paid for, you've committed to a certain amount of spend, and now make sure you actually use it before you go do other things. Use your
Exactly.
reserved instances, those sorts of things.
Right, because it's a use it or lose it proposition. There's no rollover minutes for, like on mobile phones for servers and databases. But what I found interesting at this event was it showed how the FinOps community, which is largely, there are large providers there, the cloud providers, which, have amazing tools to help their customers manage spend on their platforms. The FinOps startups collect data from all of the platforms that a customer might use, and we've seen that multi-cloud is a fact of life. So and then but they use different methods of kind of concatenating them and addressing waste, identifying unused instances, and so on. But what I saw at this conference was basically how the FinOps vendor community is responding to the advent of AI enabled interactions between their data and maybe data in other domains. And that is that they're rebuilding they're getting their data houses in order, which is something that enterprises are struggling with too, right? To actually get a return on their AI investments. And they can use that and they can examine that data for their own purposes as well. So to not only to provide their customers with delightful services, but also to guide their roadmaps, to give their customers benchmarks in terms of their how they're optimizing their environments and their software usage. And so, that's one thing that I thought was pretty interesting about this show. And then another thing is that FinOps is becoming more of a sort of proactive discipline, and it's becoming, and especially again talking about AI projects, these tools are what companies are going to turn to help them greenlight AI projects that potentially are going to cost them a lot of money, and they need some empirical information to be able to justify that expense and de-risk the investments that they're making in AI.
Because this is one of the things that we see in the voice of the enterprise data, which is the two basically neck and neck reasons for AI project failure are budget issues and data quality. And the of course, the nirvana, Melanie, to your point, is to be able to say up front, oh, if we build it this way, here's what this is going to cost, and we'll know a priori what that cost is going to be. The difficulty, though, is that we're still a long way from that, even though, Melanie, to your point, we are seeing that shift in terms of what is the unit or the measurement for cost, and whether or not that happens to be tokens or whatever particular aspect of the AI process and the computational cost gets rolled into that. We're still at a point at which actually predicting what that model consumption is still pretty complex. Certainly that's the goal, but are we close to getting there? And what are the challenges in terms of actually being able to get to a point at which we can predict what costs are going to look like?
I think one thing that FinOps culture could use to inform some of the AI initiatives going on right now is to just take a step back and think about what it is you're trying to accomplish. What are you trying to do? Right. So at some level, cost management is about culture, right? To what extent do you sit down and come up with a clear plan for what you're doing in the first place? And okay, AI is a little bit different. There's a lot of trial and error, and some eggs are going to end up on the floor instead of in a pan as part of the omelet, right? But the
It's
dog
AI,
can lick it up.
come on,
It's
it's
fine.
worth it. It's going to be worth it no matter what, right?
But I
Move
think
fast and
that
break some eggs. Okay.
exactly. But eggs are so expensive now, though.
Ooh, good point.
It, I think it comes down to it to some extent with culture, and this is one thing that sometimes gets lost in the discussion about FinOps. It's not just about these technologies and platforms and data lakes and algorithms and dashboards. It's about creating a culture of, I guess, cost consciousness, in the sense that when you're dealing in an on demand cloud OpEx kind of world, the rules of the game have changed a bit. And you actually do have to think about what you're building and how much it's going to cost, regardless of whether that at some point down the road translates into business metrics or not. The fact of the matter is that IT departments have budgets, and if you overshoot the budget, then you might not have a job for much longer. So there's the idea that to make all of this work in an AI oriented world, what you need to have is collaboration across all of the different business units and stakeholders within an enterprise. And this is another one of those long time nirvana aspects of IT, is that at some point, IT, line of business, and the app developers will all be on the same page, all going towards the same goal. So I think as far as being able to predict AI costs, you'll never be able to do that, I don't think, because in an on-demand world, if you put something out there and you underestimated how popular it was going to be, then you end up overshooting your cloud budget. But if that happens, you have to pay more for the infrastructure because what the infrastructure supports ended up exceeding your wildest dreams in terms of take up or, adoption or revenue, then that's kind of a good problem to have.
Well, but we already
So,
see that in the vote data, right? Which is that people are already spending more than they thought they were going to spend on AI, and if that requires IT teams, and also IT teams and business leaders across the organization to all grab their guitars and start singing "Kumbaya," that seems like a big ask to get to that point. I don't know.
yeah, I mean, it's all iterative, right? I mean, if you think about it, cloud's been around a long time. Think about it another way, not really. So we had AWS come along with S3 in 2006. You had ChatGPT come out in 2022. So if you just look at it in terms of, okay, it's taken us 20 years to get to the point where people are taking a serious look at, what do we do with cloud costs? How do we do cloud cost management? Hopefully it won't take the same amount of time for AI to get there as it has for cloud to get there. But, hopefully a lot of the combined learnings in the cloud space, and as we go along the road to AI, it'll get figured out because you'll have the industry figuring it out. You'll have this whole ecosystem of FinOps vendors, and now we've got the IT asset management vendors, and we've got the technology business management space, all kind of focused on this whole issue that if you need infrastructure to enable products, enable work, enable research and development in a digital world, then you need some kind of way to measure what that cost is and to relate it back to the business value of what you're getting. So in a way, this is just part and parcel of our evolution towards living in a more digital age, in a more digital space. And, back to Gene's point that digital is all about data and, You need to analyze that data. You need algorithms to, process that data. And then eventually that data is going to become the basis of agents who actually do some of the work for us. So it's a problem that's gnarly and big now, that has technology aspects, it has cultural aspects, but it's something that's going to have to get figured out at some point, because we're not going back to all CapEx all the time in technology. A lot of it is going to be OpEx going forward. And when it is OpEx, you got the CFO, you got the board of directors talking about it. And this is something we've noticed over the last couple of years, that for some big companies, their cloud costs come out in their earnings call because they're so material as a percentage of total cost of goods sold, that there's broad awareness of the problem. And then when there's broad awareness of a problem, you've got more hands on deck to find the solution.
And it's a market opportunity.
Exactly. So that's good for us, who tend to look quite a lot at this space. And one thing we're kind of predicting on the supply side of this is, the big question is, FinOps has kind of grown up as a separate practice or discipline oriented around the, at the time, novel aspect of infrastructure as OpEx. Now, that's kind of table stakes. That's what happens. And with AI, you're bringing a lot of software into the mix too, in addition to all the infrastructure and the hardware. So we need a way to look at all of that together. So it'll be an interesting ride in the IT management tool space over the next couple of years. And we're expecting to keep seeing startups pop up, and we expect to start seeing some M&A activity heat up, as well as folks who do FinOps want the ITAM capabilities, want software asset management capabilities, as observability gets baked into the mix. And then you'll see some of the more established IT software management pieces of the market want to grab onto the FinOps piece of it as well. So it's definitely a market segment to keep an eye on.
Starting to get to that question of which fish are eating which other fish. So, well, and Gene, I think to your point, this is it's now starting to be much more all-encompassing. I mean, it sounds like that's where we're headed.
Yep.
Absolutely. And if there's anything we learned sort of in the first rodeo with cloud and AI, this next phase of it is going to be all about ecosystems as well. Like, there's no one stack to rule them all. Like any Gen AI stack, any sort of cloud-based business stack at this point, there are a lot of different components involved. And integrating all those components together and, APIing all of them together at some point, that's going to generate a lot of data, which is going to start getting organizations to take a more forensic lens on their IT to see, how can we optimize this or that piece of it. And to some extent, sometimes tinkering around with the financials of things, gives you some good ideas on, how you can build things better. And that's what I expect us to see going forward.
Well, there's a lot of looking to build it better that's being driven by AI, so clearly a lot of impetus. Well, this has been great, and I guess we'll have to see where this crazy road happens to take us, but clearly a lot of potential behind it. One more thing that we need to keep our eyes on as we go hurtling towards whatever the AI next is. But thank you both for being back on.
Thanks a lot, Eric. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
But we are unfortunately at time for this episode. So that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Ron Mudation, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. I hope you'll join us for our next episode where, Gene, you're going to be back talking about developer productivity and automation. We'll have a guest from AWS on with us, so I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.